maker's marks in our life, the marks of discipleship, those followers of Jesus as they gathered around him. We've been working our way through the Gospel of Matthew and hearing some of Matthew's teachings about what it is to be marked by our Maker. And just in case this is your first time with us in this series, there are no bourbon samples. There will be no bourbon samples of Maker's Mark. The samples are right here in our Bibles. We're going to sample a little bit of God's Maker's Mark on us through a parable, which this time again is a teaching unique to Matthew. This one does not occur in Mark or Luke or John. You will find it only in Matthew, and you will find it in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. So let us hear the word of the Lord according to Matthew about what the Maker's marks of God's love look like for us who gather around Jesus seeking the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a usual daily wage, he sent them out into the vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last, and then going to the first." And those hired about 5 o'clock came. Each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled. Say that with me. They grumbled. Can you imagine church people grumbling? They grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious? Because I am generous. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Thanks be to God." This is the word of God for the people of God. And then I'm going to ask you, do you really believe that? Do you really mean thanks be to God? Now, I know that we have lots of UK fans in the congregation. I know not everybody's a UK fan, and so especially those who are not, maybe are really happy about what happened last night. But if you're a Kentucky fan, and if you're not a Kentucky fan, imagine your own team. Don't you think that if the last were really first, UK would have won last night?
But they were first for 59 minutes and 17 seconds.
Did you get that? Jen Heron, they were first for 59 minutes and 17 seconds. So yes, indeed, the first have become last. Before I heard about the outcome of the game, I wanted to start the sermon by asking, have you ever felt cheated before? And then I saw the front page this morning. Just short, Cats give it away to the Gators again. And I thought, man, if I were there and I sat through 59 minutes and 17 seconds of winning, I would have felt cheated. What does it feel like, feeling cheated? Anybody? Y'all never been cheated before.
Angry.
Angry? What else?
Frustrated.
Frustrated. What else?
Sad.
Sad. What else?
Mad.
fair.
Are y'all all here? What is it?
Not fair.
It's not fair. The kids understand this. We don't have to explain this children's lesson to them. They get it. It is, Abby said, it's not fair. That is the problem with Matthew's parable of the laborers in the vineyard that he says Jesus tells to his disciples when he's describing the kingdom of heaven. It's not fair. I don't know about you, but that's not usually a word or phrase I link up with the kingdom of heaven. That the kingdom of heaven is a place that's not fair. But what's worse about this to me is that Jesus even admits it's not fair. He says that's the whole purpose of it. For the last will be first, and the first will be last. And by God, that's not fair. But let me ask you this. In the parable that we read together and that Nan shared with the children, is this really true in this parable? That their last are first and the first are last? Is that really true? Are the last first? Are they better off than the first? Are the first really last? Are they treated any differently? What do you think? No. They are not first and last. They're all the same. They all get the same amount. I mean, the only thing you could say is that the last workers were paid first, but they weren't paid more. They were all paid the same amount. So what's the problem? Why does it feel so unfair? Why did the kids instinctively say, when Nan told them the story, that's not fair? Listen to what Matthew says again in verses 13 through 15. Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose, what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? Now that's the New Revised Standard Version. Let me share that last little part with you from a different version of the Bible, the New International Reader's Version. Instead of saying, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me, or are you envious because I am generous? See, we're trying to get at what feels unfair here. In the New International Reader's Version, it says this: don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Do you feel cheated because I gave so freely to the others? See, we're getting at something. Maybe it's not actually unfair, but it feels unfair, right? There's another translation. This is a fairly new one by N.T. Wright, who's one of the scholars in the evangelical community, who's sort of done his own paraphrase the way Eugene Peterson has done. And this is called the New Testament for Everyone. Are you suggesting that I'm not allowed to do what I like with my own money? Get this. Or are you giving me the evil eye because I'm good? Okay, you guys know what that is? Can everybody give me the evil eye? Give me the evil eye. Oh, come on, Sierra, that's not evil at all. Now, Calvin, I know that Sierra can give the evil eye. You're not going to say a word about that.
Hired the vendor tomorrow. Won't have workers who work in the game, so he can be as generous as he wants while he's broke.
Okay. Are you giving? Do you know that actually giving you the evil eye is much closer to the literal translation of the Greek? It says, "Or is your eye evil because mine is good?" In the Greek, literally. So the problem here with this parable is not injustice. It is not that there's an unfair treatment. The problem here, in some respects, is mercy. Justice, we understand. Mercy, We're great if it's for us, but we're not so great if it's for somebody else. And in this case, it's not really mercy because we're not talking about somebody being punished and having that punishment released, but it's what he says, generosity, goodness. Are you envious, the NRSV says, because I am generous? Or some versions, are you jealous because I am good? Are you giving me the evil eye because I am good? So the problem is not so much that the first group of workers got cheated, that they did not get what was agreed upon, because they got exactly what was agreed upon. But that somehow they feel like that they didn't get what they deserved only because the other group got more than what they thought they deserved. Even though the other group also agreed to the usual daily wage. But it appeared that to the first group that the last group got more than what the first group thought they deserved. You see, if you go back and look at verse 4 of Matthew 20, and he said to them, this is to the group, he went out at 9 o'clock and he went out at, again at 3 o'clock. I'm sorry, he went out at 9 o'clock and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said, you also go into the vineyard and I will pay you whatever is right. You see, with the first group, the early morning group, he said, after agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them out into the vineyard. But in verse 4, with the second group, he says, I will pay you whatever is right. And then what the owner decides is right is also the usual daily wage, even though they aren't starting until later in the day. So I want you to hear a few of these versions. So here in the NRSV and lots of other versions, NIV, New English Translation, Common English Bible, they all say whatever is right. King James, go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, I will give to you. I really like the whatsoever because, again, in the Greek, that is very literal. It literally, the way that grammar there is, means not just whatever, but whatsoever. Like, it could be anything. And there's a version called Young's Literal Translations. This was done back in the 1800s. It's very similar to the King James, but he says, whatsoever is righteous. Not whatsoever is right, but whatsoever is righteous. Now, does righteous have a different connotation to you than right? It may not. Good News Translation. You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you a fair wage. Aha! This is where we're starting to get to it, right? Who decides what's a fair wage? You go also into the vineyard, and I will pay you a fair wage. Then there's the New Century Version. Now this one, we're getting there. If you go work in my vineyard, I will pay you what your work is worth. If you go work in my vineyard, I will pay you what your work is worth. And then finally, in the New American Bible Revised Edition, you two go into my vineyard and I will give you what is just. As in, what is justified. What is justice. Now, why so much difference? The Greek word here is dikaios, and it literally is the word that gets translated most often righteousness. And then the next most often way it gets translated is just or justice. It literally means equitable and by implication holy or innocent because it's right. If something is righteous, it is right. And then the Old King James, it is meet, not M-E-A-T. M-E-E-T, meaning it is appropriate. You see, I think looking at all these different translations, we're finally going to get to what's going on for this first group of workers. It's not that an injustice was done here because, yes, the owner of the vineyard had the right to decide what was right, what was equitable, what was fair, what was just. But the heart of the matter is that human beings, some of us are offended. We are offended when we perceive those showing up late to the game getting the same as everyone else. It just doesn't seem right to us. It doesn't seem right to us. Now there's one little other interesting tidbit here that I think, in our quickness to say it's unfair, we often overlook. And this comes at the place where the owner of the vineyard goes out to this last group. And this is verse 6 and 7 of chapter 20. At about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" You're already feeling angry, aren't you? They're standing around. Why? Verse 7. Because no one has hired us. Our immediate judgment is they're lazy. They're lazy. When in fact, they are underemployed. They are unemployed. They are laid off. They are overlooked. Or, in some cases, they are discriminated against. There certainly has been a time in our culture, and perhaps it's even still happening now, when someone doesn't get hired just because the owner doesn't like the way they look, or where they're from, or how old they are. Try getting a job when you're 55 and laid off. Good luck. They are the fringe, the underrepresented, the outcast, the voiceless, the margin folk. Yesterday, my husband David, who's a minister at Second Presbyterian, invited me to participate in a panel discussion at his church that was related to a lecture series they always do about this time of year. And since this is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, of when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door at the Wittenberg Church in 1517, so now 2017 is 500 years later, they had a speaker come in and talk about justification and justice, an unfinished agenda of 500 years of reforming the church. You see, the Reformation started because Luther perceived that some people were not getting access to God's grace because of what he perceived to be corruption in the hierarchy of the church. Every argument, every protest, every division in the church that happened then and since then, and really was happening before then, is related to who is justified and who isn't, and how do you get access. And in this event, we watched a video clip of a woman who's now my hero. She's a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa. Her name is Reverend Nadia Marias. And when she was speaking, she was asking what the church needed to hear today about justification and justice, and about how our work of justifying people is still left undone. And she specifically lifted up the wife of a famous 20th century theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, who's a German. But his wife, Elisabeth Moltmann Wendell, is also a theologian, and she's just died recently. And so this woman, she was actually talking to Mr. Moltmann, to Reverend Jürgen Moltmann, and she says, "I wonder what your wife would say to the church today about justification and justice, about what it is to be a reforming church today. And this is what she said. This really struck me. She said a church, she believes, Mrs. Moltmann would say, a church which is going forward, continuing to reform, is a church that calls upon the memory of Mary Magdalene. And I went, what does Mary Magdalene have to do with the Reformation? In my head. I didn't say that out loud because I was on the panel and I didn't want to embarrass my husband. But she persisted. She said, the memory of Mary Magdalene is not uncomplicated in our churches. For Magdalene and those like her still, and those like her, Magdalene and those like her, are still not justified in our churches today. So let's try this little experiment. Okay? Either on your bulletin or in your mind, I want you to list every word that you associate with Mary Magdalene. Okay? Either write it down on your bulletin, or a scrap piece of paper if you got it, or just in your mind. Every word you associate with Mary Magdalene. Let's hear some of those words. Mary Magdalene.
I have seen the Lord.
I've seen the Lord. Others? Beloved. Others?
Humble servant.
Humble servant. Anybody else?
Prostitute.
Prostitute. Anybody else? Devoted. Okay. Anybody else?
Misunderstood.
Misunderstood. Anybody else?
Misrepresented.
Misrepresented. Others?
I don't know how to love him.
I don't know how to love him. Ah, good. Is that Jesus Christ Superstar? Anything else about Mary Magdalene that you remember from your youth or your adulthood? Courageous. I'll tell you what, we have some fine folk here at Twin Pines. I imagine in some settings, the only words we would have heard would have been prostitute, sinner, demon-possessed. Fortunately for you, because you have such a great minister, you already knew that she is the first preacher of the resurrection. I have seen the Lord. That she was devoted to Jesus. That she was courageous. But as some of you said, she was misunderstood. You see, for much of Christendom, Mary Magdalene is remembered not as the first preacher of the resurrection, but as a sinner and a prostitute, an immoral, childless, unmarried woman who became the first casualty of church piety. See, I dare say that there is less grace for Mary Magdalene in some Christians' mind than there is for Mary, Mother of Jesus. Don't imagine too many people put Mary Magdalene and Mary, Mother of Jesus on the same level. In many circles, there is less grace for Mary Magdalene than there is for a denying apostle Peter. In many Christian circles, there is less grace for Mary Magdalene than there is for a persecuting Saul who becomes the Apostle Paul. In many Christian circles, there is less grace for Mary Magdalene than there is for a doubtful Thomas, because he's an apostle. In many Christian circles, there is less grace for Mary Magdalene because, well, she's a woman. A sinful woman. And so even a Roman centurion gets more grace because he converted. And he's a man with means and power. In many Christian circles, there is less grace for a devoted Mary Magdalene than there is for sleeping disciples. In many Christian circles, there is less grace for a Mary Magdalene who does not know how to love him and yet loves him than there is for disciples who flee from the cross for fear for their lives. For in many Christian circles, Mary Magdalene is a Johnny-come-lately 11th hour sinner who deserves less of God's grace than those who do not have as much of a sinful past. Whether we think so or not, I guarantee you there are Christians who think she got more than what she deserved. And so her story became distorted by the church, naming her as a prostitute, which, by the way, never once anywhere in the New Testament is it ever mentioned that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. The only negative thing mentioned about her is that she had 7 demons that Jesus cast out from her. Where the prostitute idea comes from is largely from church tradition, where some theologian somewhere, and I didn't look it up so I can't tell you who, but associated the woman caught in adultery. That story in John about the woman caught in adultery. Remember, the people want to stone her, and Jesus says, put down your stones, and whichever one of you doesn't have any sin, you just go ahead and pick up a stone and throw it at her. There was some theologian somewhere who said, well, that was probably Mary Magdalene. Oh my goodness, well that was it. She was stuck with that scarlet letter for the rest of her history, even though never once in the New Testament anywhere does it say that she was a prostitute. So her story became distorted by the church. You see, unfortunately, it has persisted. As much as we love artful things like Jesus Christ Superstar, the way Magdalene gets portrayed both in that movie and in other movies and in other productions is as a woman of the night. And so that image persists. What if the only image we had of Mary Magdalene was what Betty said, that she was devoted? So this woman, Nadia Mariah, says, remembering Mary Magdalene as a church going forward is an inconvenient experience this 500th year of the Reformation. Because in Magdalene we encounter the strange grace of the living God, a grace that does not wait until we are prepared for it, a grace that is not given on our terms, a grace that is not fair, a grace that does not ask our permission, a grace that overwhelms all of us. And then she concluded her talk with these words, and this, my friends, is the question I want to leave with you. She said, perhaps the question of our time as we seek to be reforming churches still reforming in the memory of Mary Magdalene, maybe the question of our time is not so much, how can I find a gracious God so that I can be justified? But where will I find a gracious church? Not how can I find a gracious God, but where will I find a gracious church? And then she said, how we respond to this question may determine the next 500 years. And I thought to myself, when I heard that, I know exactly where people can find a gracious God and a gracious church. And that's at Twin Pines Christian Church, where we are marked by our Maker. And while we don't have bourbon samples, we have samples of God's grace and love at this table. That is a place that is open and affirming to all people. The same, no matter their past. No matter their present. No matter where they are on the scale, whether they believe or they don't believe, or they believe a lot or they believe a little, or they're in doubt. No matter what, the same, the same, the same, the same. This is a place. And I know there are people in Lexington looking for a place like this, and they have no idea we're here. And I'll tell you how I know this. I've heard it over and over again from several of you, but especially just recently, Cindy, our new music director, said to me, Benny, if I hadn't applied for this job, I wouldn't know about Twin Pines. This must be a music director thing, because prior to that, Thomas Stewart said to me, Benny, if I had not applied for this job, I wouldn't have known there was a place like Twin Pines. Folks, we gotta hand out some bourbon samples. Amen. Let me back that up. We gotta hand out some Maker's Marks samples. Okay? Not bourbon. But these samples we've been sampling in the Gospel of Matthew, the way that we're marked with our rocks and with God's grace, with forgiveness and love and mercy and justice and acceptance. We've got to get these out to people. We can't wait for them to apply for a job here. So I'm going to give you some samples, some Maker's Mark samples, and I invite you to take a couple of these and give them to somebody who is looking for a place where they can find a gracious church. To worship on Sunday, we'll fill it up with a sample of God's love. They can fill it up right here at the communion table. All right? So, Rachel, can you help pass these out? And if you'll just take a couple of these, and I'd like you to pray over these cups before you take them out. They're going to be filled with a completely different spirit than what bourbon samples are. That spirit. Oh, beautiful. See, they're going to be filled with the spirit of Rachel Hall. And you know what's awesome about that? Rachel knows that we love her 1,000%. She knows how much we love her, and she loves this place. So if you happen to get one of these cups that Rachel touched, it's got even more proof of God's love in it than the other ones. All right? So let's take these during our time of prayer. Also, if you'd like to light a candle or put a prayer in the prayer box, let us be in prayer for people who need to know God's grace, to find a gracious God and a gracious church here at Twin Pines. Let us pray together.